with the turn of the millennium, there are some people who are beginning to get worried about prophecy, about the idea or concept that Jesus is coming back soon. In fact, maybe some are willing or just about ready to throw in the towel. Well, on today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to take another look at the study of prophecy, at the day of the Lord and the coming tribulation period through the eyes of the apostles. Gary Stimmer is here to discuss with me this fascinating New Testament truth.
And J.R., the apostles were entrusted with, shall we say, refining the words of Jesus. Jesus himself did not write. In fact, as far as we know, he never left any sort of written record, but he surrounded himself with a group of men who later, when filled with the Holy Spirit, would be able to remember and record, but even more than that, to prophesy about events in the church age. It was given to them to allow the church age to function in wisdom rather than darkness. And J.R., their key word was watch. They wanted all the members of the church to continually be watching.
So we're going to talk about the Apostle Paul and what he had to say, James and Jude and the other writers of the New Testament, the apostles themselves. They had a distinct message concerning the second coming of Christ. And Gary, let's begin with Paul in the book of Romans and how he addressed this present time.
You know, the book of Romans is not usually thought of as a book of prophecy at all, and yet it's a perfect illustration of the way the Bible incorporates prophecy even into its doctrinal statements. In Romans 11:5 and 6 we read, "Even so at this present time also there is a remnant according to the election of grace, and if by grace it is no more of works, otherwise grace is no more grace, but if it be of works, then is no more grace, otherwise work is no more work." Now here Paul is talking about the grand subject of justification by faith through grace, but he's addressing the topic of national Israel. He's talking about his people, the Jews, and he's saying there is a remnant according to the election of grace. Now that is a magnificent prophetic statement.
Now the Apostle Paul goes on to elaborate on this, and he gets to verses 11 and 12, and he talks about the casting away of Israel so that Gentiles could be brought into the fold. Tell us about it, Gary.
Yeah, and he makes a fascinating statement, which is also a prophetic statement. He says here in 11:12, "Now if the fall of them," that is the Jews, "be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness." This tells us with absolute clarity that national Israel will have the experience of fullness. That is, the things prophesied by the Lord will one day come to pass.
In the previous verse, we are told that they stumbled, that God has sort of cast them away. Have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid, but rather through their fall, salvation has come to the Gentiles. So there is a time, he is predicting here, when Gentiles would be able to be saved, but that there would come a time when Israel would be received again. So Israel's fall from the Lord was not permanent. It was temporary. In fact, he went on to talk about the branches of the olive tree.
Yes, he did.
And Gentiles as wild olive branches were grafted in. But the root is in Israel. And one day, he said, Paul said, God would graft the good branches back into that tree again, which indicated, of course, that there was coming an end to this dispensation of the Gentiles.
And all this is as clear as crystal, of course, in Isaiah 11:11. And isn't it fascinating that we find in Romans 11:11 this statement about Israel stumbling? In Isaiah 11:11, it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people. And J.R., that second time, well, the first one was after the Babylonian captivity. We're seeing the second one, I believe, in our day.
In this century.
In this century, and here's a key point to make. Men in the last century, godly men, E.W. Bullinger, J.N. Darby of the Plymouth Brethren, and later men like Clarence Larkin, C.I. Schofield, took these verses literally and began to build a, shall we say, a prophetic framework around the literal regathering of Israel.
In fact, E.W. Bullinger did something that most people, most theologians, frown on. He calculated 2,520 years, didn't
yes, he did.
And he came up with a remarkable date in his day. I think it was, what, 1897?
Mm-hmm. 1897 was the convocation in Switzerland, by the way, of the first Zionist conference. Theodor Herzl was there, and it started the whole movement that 50 years later became Israeli statehood.
Now listen to what Bullinger wrote, and I quote, "From this eclipse cycle, it appears that A.D. 1896-97 would mark an important year in connection with the times of the Gentiles. The above reckoning has the following advantages over previous historical interpretations. One, Bullinger said, controverted dates are excluded. Two, the whole period of 2,520 years is dealt with instead of only the latter half of 1,260, as is usually the case. And he's talking about the times of the Gentiles here. Three, it confines these times to one place where the Lord himself put them, Jerusalem."
Mm-hmm. Jerusalem.
And hey, isn't that amazing that in that year, the World Zionist Congress took place. Bullinger wrote this years before.
He did,
but
years
it is
before.
Interesting that something did happen in that year.
Now, Bullinger and others like him illustrate the premise we're working on today. Don't let anyone tell you that because, for example, the catching away of the church is said to be a signless event, that therefore we shouldn't be looking because there's no way to detect events that will precede the rapture. That is, nothing given. I believe the apostles painted a different picture than that. They show us that there are reasons why we should be watching.
Now, in 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul had some interesting things to say about the coming resurrection. Gary, tell us about it.
And he talked about the coming resurrection, which we're looking forward to at the rapture, by describing the Jewish festival cycle. But now, he says, Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept. And he goes on to say this, but every man in his own order, Christ the first fruits, afterward they that are Christ's at his coming, then cometh the end when he shall have delivered up the kingdom to God. Well, J.R., any intelligent Bible student here sees an order of events. Again, we have a framework within which to set prophecy.
And he promises, then cometh the end. In other words, the human race will not just continue.
Right.
There will come the last day of the last person being born and the last person being born again. Mm-hmm. In 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, the Apostle Paul, and we're dealing here through the eyes of the apostles, and Paul, of course, apostle out of due season, he's the one who wrote most prolifically about this subject. In 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, he addresses the times, doesn't he, Gary?
He does indeed, and he encourages the Thessalonican believers to be watchful. Here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, starting with verse 6, he says, therefore let us not sleep as do others, but let us watch and be sober, for they that sleep, sleep in the night. They that be drunken are drunken in the night. But let us who are of the day be sober. Now, J.R., this is clearly an invocation and an exhortation to watch. But my question is, why watch if there's nothing to watch? There's got to be something that we're supposed to be watching.
Has to be signs of the times we can look at if we're to watch.
Exactly.
If you're watching and there's nothing out there, then you get kind of tired watching, you know. But I want you to know that Jesus is coming soon, and we know that there are things happening across the world in this century and in this past century that is just now being concluded that certainly points toward the second coming, and namely the return of the Jews to their land. That is the one big sign, isn't it, Gary?
It is. Geopolitically, Israel controls everything, just as Zechariah predicted. He said Jerusalem would be a cup of trembling, and so it is to this day. You know, J.R., in 1 Timothy, Paul writes in 1 1 Timothy 4:1, now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits. This is the other side of watching. The one side, as we pointed out, is national Israel as a sign to the Gentiles. The other side is that the apostles give clues as to what society would look like at the very end of the latter days. And we've got a break coming up, J.R.
And when we return, we'll look at James, Jude, and John, and Peter. We'll be back in just a moment. The main theme of the Apostle Paul's writings was watch. For this dispensation into which we have entered, called the dispensation of grace, will come to a conclusion one day. Watch the Jew. He will lead you to the end. Watch, for one of these days there are going to be signs that you can understand. And Jesus coming then will be that much quicker, that much sooner. You'll know about when it's coming. Now, when we get to James, he talks about globalism. We get to Peter, he talks about the millennial day. We get to Jude, he talks about false teachers. And John, of course, the great revelator, talks about the 7 churches. We're going to try to deal with that on today's program. First, let's go to the social issue, the Apostle Paul writing in 2 Timothy.
Mm-hmm. And we have Israel on the one hand, the general conditions of society on the other. Paul writes in 2 Timothy 3, verse 1, this know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come. Then Paul gives Timothy, the young preacher, a list of personal character breakdowns that would characterize human beings of the last age. But the term perilous times is translated from a Greek word kalepos, which is used only one other place in the New Testament, Matthew 8:28, and we read about Jesus meeting a demonized pair of men. And when he was come to the other side into the country of the Gergesenes, there met him 2 possessed with devils, coming out of the tombs exceeding fierce, so that no man might pass by that way. And J.R., the term exceeding fierce is translated from kalepos, the same word that Paul used for perilous times. Now, to me, this means raging insanity will be a social issue.
Demon possessed.
Demon possession. Now, I ask you, what would make a young boy hoard ammunition until one day, in an unexpected fashion, he walks in and begins to gun down his classmates? What would make a young man march into a church in Texas, as recently happened, mow down a Wednesday night Bible study for no apparent reason? These things are happening.
Drive-by shootings.
Drive-by shootings.
It's so prevalent today. Just killing for the fun of killing. This is happening all across America. I'm sure it's happening in other nations of the world. It's as if they are possessed by some demonic force. There is no answer for why they do what they do. That's the society we live in today, Gary. That's a sign of the times, isn't it?
Perilous times, and it was called for in the last of this age. So, again, this gives us something to watch for. And believe me, we're observing this very carefully.
Now let's talk about James, the apostle who was in his book talking about the rich men and talking about the I'm just tempted to call it the Gatton-NAFTA treaties, Gary.
Yes, indeed. I think you're right on there, because James speaks about rich men who have heaped together, and I'm going to paraphrase James 5:1-4. They've heaped together treasure for the last days, and their gold and silver will be rendered valueless. And James gives the answer to why. And here's why. Not only, he says, if you heap together a treasure for the last days, behold the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud. J.R., this 20th century is the century of Bolshevism, global communism, Maoism, which takes laborers and strips them clean of everything they produce. Think about East Germany. I think about even social democracy in Europe, which has unfairly robbed the producing class of its profits. And I think of a global march towards socialism. and yet the people at the top are getting fabulously wealthy, and they're using that money in an effort to control society. And so here's a sign that we can watch for. Well, James talks about these rich men, and then he adds one little sentence which tells it all. James 5:8, "Be ye also patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh." In other words, James is saying, when you begin to see this kind of globalism develop and reach the point of total ferment, be patient, because the coming of the Lord is drawing near.
Mm-hmm. And we can see that today. The global control of the distribution of wealth and resources points to the second coming, so sure. Peter talks about the millennial day, the day of the Lord, and to me this is one of the greatest insights in the New Testament through the eyes of the apostles.
And Peter, of course, writes in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, "Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, Where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation." Well, Peter answers this way. He reminds those scoffers of two things. He said, number one, there was a great flood of Noah. And number two, one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Now this, J.R., is an amazing truth.
Yes, takes us right back to the 6 days of creation that was developed by Moses. And we have arrived at the end of 6 days. The Sabbath draws nigh.
It does.
Well, let's look at Jude and his concept of the false teachers in the last days. Jude, one chapter long, great book.
It's a great book. It talks about false teachers. And it calls them filthy dreamers and mockers who walk after their own godly lusts, and it defines their motivation. They are sensual. That is, they're in the gospel for what they can get out of it, not preaching for the love of the Lord or for ministry, but to enrich themselves. And Jude implies that in the latter days of the church age, these false teachers would rise to prominence. This is just another thing to watch for.
The corruption of the gospel.
Yes.
And we can see that through ecumenical movements today. Amazing. Well, let's talk about John and the 7 churches, because this, to me, is one of my favorite. These 7 churches literally cover 2,000 years of church history. It's remarkable how he so clearly defines this.
Now, you don't think of John ordinarily as writing as a prophet, and yet when the Lord gave him the picture of the 7 churches, he gave the 7 churches in order. Ephesus, the church of the apostles, is said to span the years from 30 to 100 after Christ. Smyrna, the 2nd church, is said to be the church under Roman persecution from AD 100 to about AD 312. And Pergamum, the 3rd church, from 312 to 600, the Roman church. Thyatira, 600 to 1517, the time of the Dark Ages. And then Sardis, the church of the Reformation, about AD 1517, the days of Luther, to about AD 1700. The missionary church, Philadelphia, spans about 1640, perhaps 1648, through about 1900, the height of the global missionary movement. And then Laodicea, the apostate church, from 1900 to the present, and that's been about 100 years. And I wish we had more time to talk about this, J.R., because it's a fascinating picture.
So here we have 2,000 years of church history pre-recorded by John in AD 96. And it is unmistakable, Gary, what you have given there. As we look back at history, we can so clearly see Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea is absolutely descriptive of this last century.
And if you have given up on prophecy, if you're tired of what the magazines call millennial madness, and if you've heard people say, it's no use looking because you can't tell the times and the seasons, everybody's tried and they've all made mistakes. If you are frustrated, remember, you were invited to keep watching.
That's right. You know, the interesting thing about the Lord spewing Laodicea out of his mouth, this throwing up sort of thing is actually the meaning of this 19th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Kov, having to do with, and the letter 20 of regurgitating. It's a fascinating study, and I think we can see this through the eyes of the apostles. We'll be back in just a moment.